Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a lesson on wireless networking. Now, I will tell you, when it comes to wireless networking, before we get into some of the actual ins and outs and the details of how it works, I want to talk to you about more of the why behind wireless networking. What are some of the benefits of using wireless networking? And I will tell you, the first benefit that I'll mention is easily the biggest, and it's simple. No more cables! Yay! Okay, I mean, if you've ever worked with cables or network cable, and I know we've talked about some of it here in this course, it can be a pain. There are some real obstacles that you may have to get around. Now, when it comes to not having to use cables anymore, and when we start talking about wireless networking, another benefit is, well, and again, it relates, it's easier to install. Right? There's no physical cables to lay down. You don't have to do that component of the work. It's just the airwaves. So installing a wireless network is just about configuring, and that's it. Another benefit, and I mentioned obstacles, well, now I can talk about it in the literal fashion. You can connect networks through walls and other physical obstacles. Now, we'll learn when we get further into the lesson that certain types of wireless, can transmit through those obstacles easier than other types. But the reality is that you can have wireless go from one room to another right through those walls. Can't always do that so easily with cables, can we? I mean, especially if we're talking about like solid brick walls, or maybe you're in an old building where there are some very strict rules about what you can, well, quite frankly, destroy, right, by drilling holes and running cables. How about temporary access to your network, right? You have a guest come into your office and they need to get onto your network. How many times, it's like I'm asking you, maybe you have experience with this, maybe you don't. But I know with my experience, the number of times that I've had somebody come in and I'm sitting there wasting 20 minutes, 30 minutes just running around looking for a cable to plug them in, or maybe a jack that's not being used in a wall to plug them into. That's a problem. So wireless is a great way for somebody to come in with a laptop, open it up, just give them a password and they're on your network. Now, speaking of giving a password, I have one more thing to mention here when we talk about benefits of wireless networking. And this one's a benefit, or maybe it's not. They say that wireless networking is now equally secure. Is it? Well, I'll tell you what, we're going to talk briefly about some of the wireless security in this lesson, but then I have another lesson that is truly going to be all about wireless security. And I will tell you that I suppose arguments could be made that maybe wireless networking is not quite as secure, but I'll tell you, even if you're on that side of the argument, it's pretty darn close. Okay, so I just want to kind of throw that in there. It's not necessarily a benefit because it's not more secure. That would be a benefit. But we've gotten to a day and age where wireless networking, I think, is pretty close to being equally as secure as using physical cables. So now the next thing that I really want you to understand if you're going to set up a wireless network is some of these, I have them listed as components of a wireless access point. They are kind of components of a wireless network, but they relate to the access point. So that's why I have it listed that way here. I will also tell you that I'm going to be explaining these items to you in a much more simplistic direction than a truly 100% technically accurate direction. And I mention this just because if you have had wireless networking training before watching this lesson, you may find that what I'm telling you is in a little bit of, I don't want to say conflict, but the context of how it's being presented is a little bit different. At this point, I want you to just have a real basic understanding of some of these terms. And the first one is BSS, which stands for Basic Service Set. Now, a basic service set means that you are basically creating a wireless network with a single access point. Okay? I mean, that's your BSS. From there, we have ESS, which stands for Extended Service Set. And guess what? If a basic service set is only one access point, What do you think an extended service set is? Yeah, it means that you are using multiple access points in order to create the wireless network. Okay, so there's a way to use more than one wireless access point and have them all work in conjunction with one another to create this single wireless network. Now, regardless of whether you are working within a basic service set or an extended service set, a term that you really need to be familiar with, and I would say that if you don't hang on to anything else from these components right here, the one you need to make sure that you are familiar with is a term called SSID, which stands for Service Set Identifier. What is the Service Set Identifier? It's the name of your wireless network. So when you open up a wireless client and you are looking to connect with a wireless network, you see a list of networks that are available. Well, when you see that list of networks that are available, what you're seeing is a list of service set identifiers, the names of the wireless networks that are out there. Now, the extended service set identifier, or the ESSID, I will tell you, is not a real big deal. It means the service set identifier when using multiple access points. All right, so just like the extended service set means you're using multiple access points, the extended service set identifier is the identifier or the name of the network when using multiple access points. But here's where it gets just a little bit tricky, and that is the BSSID, or the basic service set identifier, does not tie in the same way with the basic service set, right? In other words, we talked about basic service set being one access point and extended service set being multiple. Well, if the extended service set identifier is the identifier with multiple, wouldn't the basic be when there's only one? Well, the answer is actually no. This is where they mix it up a little bit. The basic service set identifier is essentially the MAC address of the wireless access point. Okay, so even in an environment where you have multiple access points all working together to create an extended service set, each one of those individual access points will have a basic service set identifier so that you can recognize that one access point versus another one on the same network. Now, the last term that I have here is BSA, which stands for Basic Service Area, and it is just that. It's the area that's being serviced by the access point. Okay, we'll talk in just a moment here about the placement of your access point, and the placement is very important based upon the basic service area that it's going to cover. So now, speaking of where to place your wireless access points, I will tell you that the placement of your wireless access points is really important. I mean, it is key to having a good wireless network and a not so good wireless network. Okay, because these wireless access points have everything to do with, are people going to be able to get on the network or not? Now, I will tell you that if you're going to be a full-time wireless network administrator, there are a lot of details that go way beyond the scope of this course that you're going to want to learn about how wireless access points function, and more specifically, how the signals are transmitted from them. But for right now, I'm going to give you a basic set of questions that you would want to ask to help you understand how to set up a basic wireless network. And the first of those questions is, where are our wireless clients located? I mean, think about it. Many people will go into this and they'll say, well, here's our office floor plan, and this is what we have to cover. Is it? Or maybe we only need to cover the conference room area. Right? Maybe no one else in the company is using wireless other than during meetings and maybe when guests come in. If that's the case, then this is the area you're trying to cover, not this. Now, speaking of areas you want to cover, how far can the wireless access point send and receive its signals? Different hardware has different capabilities. So you want to make sure that you place it in a location where the distance that the signal can travel, number one, makes it to where the wireless clients are located, but number two, and we'll talk about this in more detail in just a moment, maybe isn't going too far past where those wireless clients are located. And speaking of how far can it travel, the next question is, are you using a directional antenna? Certain wireless access points will radiate out their signal almost in a perfect circle. Whereas others, you set it up, and it goes out in one direction. Okay, so if you are using one of those that the signal only travels in that one direction, you need to keep that into consideration. Now, I mentioned we would come back to this. You may need to prevent certain areas from receiving a wireless signal. Okay, so you need to look at that. And the best example I want to use right now is, go back to our simple floor plan here. And we said that we want to cover the conference room area. So maybe we go ahead and set up a wireless access point right over here, or maybe even just right above that conference area. And now that signal goes out, but wait a minute, if this was the end of our building, what's on the other side of this? If it's a building, it could be a parking lot, or maybe if it's just office space that you have, there might be another company next door. Whatever it is, you don't necessarily want to have that signal go too far beyond where your wireless clients are. I mean, if that's the parking lot, what's to stop somebody from sitting down there in a van going, hey, look at this, I can hack right into this network? Okay, so that is definitely something that you need to take into consideration if there's going to be secure information traveling on the wireless network. And one last piece of consideration that I want to talk to you about is you need to look into whether there's any other devices of any kind, and they don't have to be wireless networking devices, but any other devices that are going to also be giving off RF signals that may interfere with your wireless network. And I will tell you that I can give you two real quick examples of this right now. Number one, here in my office, we have a wireless access point. It's actually up in the ceiling, right above our kitchen. Then we went and did an analysis, and what we realized was, in that kitchen, we have a couple of microwaves which are giving off an RF signal on the exact same frequency as that wireless access point. So now that we know some of the terminology and the components that make up an access point, and we know about the placement of where to put it and all that good stuff, let's talk about some of the different wireless networking standards that we can use. Now, the first one that I want to talk to you about is, it's somewhat of an older, outdated standard. It's what's called 802.11a. And I'm just going to give you some of the specifics to it. It uses the 5 gigahertz frequency. Okay, so we're not going into an entire wireless networking course here. We just need to know some of our basics. You need to know that it's working on the 5 gigahertz frequency. And when it comes to understanding what frequency to use, it has a lot to do with interference. What other wireless transmissions may be taking place in the area, and what frequencies are they on? Okay, so 802.11a uses the 500 gigahertz frequency. It provides data rates up to 54 megabits per second. And if we were to stop right there, I mean, that sounds pretty good. I mean, from a wireless perspective, thinking, all right, well, data rates of 54 megabits per second, even by today's standards, is still considered to be pretty good. I mean, obviously, it's not as good as if you had like gigabit Ethernet, but it's pretty good. And the 5 gigahertz frequency, nothing wrong with that. But the problem was 802.11a has a very short range, okay, less than 100 feet, and it's easily obstructed. So you pretty much have to be in close proximity and have pretty clear line of sight if you're going to use 802.11a. This is part of why it's somewhat a thing of the past. The next standard, which also happens to be pretty much out of date, is 802.11b. Now this works on the 2.4 gigahertz frequency and has data rates up to 11 megabits per second. So you could probably already guess why it's out of date. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the 2.4 gigahertz frequency. And you'll notice the ranges I have listed here are up to 300 feet if you have good line of sight outdoors, or even a good solid 100 feet indoors, meaning it can go through certain obstructions without much trouble. Most of your standard drywall and things like that, it can go through that. But the problem is the data rate. The data rate is only maxed out at 11 megabits per second. And that's not your actual throughput. That's your data rate. There is a difference between the term data rate and throughput. Data rate includes everything, including overhead and everything else. Throughput is how fast data can actually be transmitted across that network. And the throughput is much less than 11 megabits per second. And just like with our wired networks, our old 10 megabit Ethernet is kind of a thing of the past. It's not considered acceptable. Well, neither is 11 megabit 802.11b. The only place where you still see B being used in an acceptable manner is if you have an environment where you're only using wireless to get out to the internet, and maybe your internet throughput isn't more than a couple megabits per second anyway. So those two are somewhat a thing of the past. Now moving into today's world, we have 802.11g, which, just like B, also uses the 2.4 gigahertz frequency. But now we have data rates up to 54 megabits per second. So now we're moving up to the type of throughput that 802.11a had to offer, but now we're doing it on the 2.4 gigahertz frequency, which means that we're going to get ranges up to 300 feet outdoors and 100 feet indoors. That's why 802.11g is still considered to be very acceptable in most small offices and home networks. But if you really want to get into a standard that is most typically used in today's world, we'd have to talk about 802.11n. 802.11n uses both 2.4 and 5 gigahertz frequencies. It gives data rates up to 100 megabits per second, and I will tell you that that information is debated. I can tell you that. There's a lot of people that will debate exactly how fast 802.11n can transmit data, but just to kind of simplify it, let's just say it can handle pretty decent rates. Okay, certainly faster rates than anything else before it. And I will also tell you that this is done in part through something called MIMO, M-I-M-O, which stands for multiple in, multiple out. So it has the idea of being able to use both the 2.4 and 5 gigahertz frequencies, and it can actually transmit and receive more than one signal at a time, and therefore beef up the data rates. And it has ranges of up to 1,000 feet. And again, a lot of debate on that. There's a lot of debate from different sources on how far you actually can travel with 802.11n. I mean, I can tell you that where I'm sitting right now, I am within 1,000 feet of an 802.11n access point, but I can't see it, okay, because I happen to be a number of obstructions away. In other words, there's a number of walls and different things that are in the way, which is not allowing me to see that network. So, you know, it doesn't mean you're always going to get 1,000 feet. It's just saying that, hey, it's a technology that really allows for some long distances and some fast speeds. And that's why it is considered to be the most common standard in today's world. Now, something I just want to, I'm literally going to just put it on the screen and just, you know, nothing that I really have to tell you in particular, nor do I want you to suddenly memorize this. This information is all easily available on the internet, but I just wanted to throw it up here, and of course that means it's included in the course. You can always reference back to it. But the specific RF channels that can be configured using 802.11b or g, meaning the 2.4 gigahertz frequency, I have them listed on the screen, okay, channels 1 through 11. I will mention one very specific thing, and that is if you are using multiple access points and they're going to be close enough that they may interfere with each other, which, by the way, if you're going to create a single network with multiple access points, they have to be close enough to interfere with each other because you want to have complete coverage. You don't want to have one having covered a certain area and then you have to actually leave that area before you get into the next one. I will tell you, and again, I can't go into the whole long lesson on it, but you want to make sure that you're 5 channels apart, meaning channels 1, 6, and 11 are the most commonly used channels because channel 1 and 6 won't interfere with each other for the most part, and 6 and 11 won't interfere with each other for the most part. Now, you technically could use, let's say, channel 2 and channel 7, but the reason those aren't used is because as soon as you use 2 and 7, well, there's no other channel you can use. Same thing if you use 3 and 8, 4 and 9, or 5 and 10. You would be limited to only 2 channels, whereas if you want to use 3, that you go to the 1, 6, and then you can go all the way to 11. As far as the RF channels used by 802.11a and n, meaning the 5 gigahertz frequency, I have them listed here. And again, nothing really to tell you. I will also tell you that with 802.11n, we get more advanced and there are more channels than we have here. Okay, so this is really nothing more than a very basic reference for you. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to show you how we can go in and configure a real simple wireless network. And although here I'm going to be using a real basic Linksys wireless router, the reality is all the basic concepts to the functionality are the same no matter what kind of wireless access point you might be using. All right, now in order to configure just about all of your wireless access points of any kind, you typically would do so through a browser on your computer. So let's go take a look and see how this all plays out. All right, so here we are looking at my desktop, and as I mentioned just a moment ago, you would typically configure a wireless access point from a web browser. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on Internet Explorer. Once in Internet Explorer, we need to connect to the wireless access point, typically by entering in the IP address. Now, just to clarify something here, the wireless network itself is not set up. In order for a wireless access point to work, it not only will provide the wireless network, but that device itself must be physically or have a wired connection to the actual network that you want to get to. And in this case, I know that I have my wireless access point connected to the same network, and when I say connected with cables, it's connected to the same network that my computer is on. So I'm going to go ahead and type in the IP address up here in the address bar, which I happen to know is 192.168.10.1. And when I hit enter, you'll see that it prompts me for a username and password. Now, this is not the same as what you would need to connect to the wireless network. This is an administrative username and password to be able to manage this access point. So let me go ahead and put in username of admin, and I won't tell you what it is, but I'll type in the password that we have set up on this wireless access point. I'll click OK. And if I typed it in correctly, then I will get into the management screen for this particular wireless access point. Now, I keep calling it a wireless access point because that's really what we're focusing on here. But I just want to point out, in case you're noticing it, this is actually a wireless G broadband router. Okay, so all that means is that it's acting as a cable modem DSL type router on top of just being a wireless access point. Now, I will also make a quick point here that it is a wireless G router, so everything that we're going to see is going to be based upon the 802.11g technology, okay, because we went through and we talked about A and B and G and N, but regardless of which one you're using, everything that I'm going to show you here is pretty much the same. Okay, so that's the idea here. Even if you were to go to corporate level wireless access points, there are much higher levels of sophistication as far as things that you can do. But as far as what I'm about to show you, it would work the same way even in those corporate level wireless access points. So in order to set up the access point, what I need to do is get out of our basic setup here for the router and click on wireless, which will take us into the wireless configuration. And you'll see here that we have basic wireless settings, and this has to do with just turning on wireless and giving it a name. And then we also have some wireless security, wireless MAC filtering. We'll take a quick look at advanced wireless settings and see if there's anything in there worth talking about. But to get things started over here on basic wireless settings, you'll see the wireless configuration is set to manual. There is this thing called Wi-Fi protected setup, which is a dynamic way that they implemented to kind of automatically go ahead and get Wi-Fi connections put in place. And I'll tell you that it was kind of, in my opinion, a great idea, but I really haven't seen it heavily implemented. Okay, I think things are still done more manually. So keeping it on manual, you'll see here the wireless network mode is disabled. And if I click on the drop-down arrow, you'll see that I then, on this particular access point, I have the choice between having it set up with 802.11b or 802.11g, or what would probably be the most common setting would be mixed. Now, I should clarify, when I say most common setting, the point is if you're using this type of a wireless access point, okay, if this is what you're using, there's a very good chance that you may still have both B and G clients out there, and that's why you would go into the mixed environment to support both. If you know for a fact that you only have G clients out there, then I will tell you that you should select G only. And the reason why is because when you put yourself in mixed mode, you are limiting some of the G capabilities. Okay, so that is a decision that has to be made. For right now, I'll actually select G only. It's not going to change anything here other than that's just what I'm going to go ahead and choose because I know that I don't have any wireless B clients left in my office here. You then, in this field right here, would fill in what you would like your SSID to be. And you'll notice it's already populated. And the reason it's already populated is because I have had this access point active in the past. Okay, I don't currently use it. Okay, we have other wireless networking around Train Signal's office. This is something that I used to have active just to give wireless to my own office. And you'll notice that the name that I gave it is fairly appropriate. Since my name is Ed and I was providing wireless to my own office, well, I called it Ed's Office. Okay? But I just want to point out that that's the name that a wireless client is going to see. From there, we come down here and we have to pick a wireless channel. Now, whether we're working with either B and or G, both of those, you may remember, function on the 2.4 gigahertz frequency. So that means that the channels are going to be anything from 1 to 11, and they're all in this 2.4 gigahertz frequency. I'm going to go ahead and select channel 6. It's right down the middle. It also means that if I needed to cooperate with other access points, I could use channels 1 and 11 without interference. Now, the last setting on this first screen here is one that has to do with security. And it is something that I'm going to cover in much more detail in the wireless security lesson. But as long as we're in here, and because it is part of setting up a wireless network, I'm going to go ahead and address some of these security issues in this demonstration. As far as SSID broadcast, I'll give you the super short version. It has to do with, do people see the name Ed's Office when they go to connect? Or do they have to know that that wireless network exists? Meaning, do I want to advertise, hey, I'm here and I'm a wireless network, and this is my name? Or do I hide that by disabling the broadcast, and then the only people who will connect are ones who know that there happens to be a wireless network out there called Ed's Office? Now, for now, I'm going to go ahead and leave it enabled. We're not worried about that aspect of security. Now, from here, on this particular device, I know that if I were to click to another screen, I would lose everything I did. So I have to click Save Settings. And when I do this, it says that the settings are successful. I will click Continue. And because I am connected via the actual wired connection and nothing changed on that wired connection, I'm able to get back to this screen. I will give you the heads up that if you are ever connected through a certain manner and you make changes to the way you're connected to the router, well then guess what? You're probably going to lose connectivity. You'll end up with some kind of screen telling you that you've lost connectivity or that the page can't be found, and you'd have to come up to your address bar and reestablish the connection based upon the new information. All right, so let's move along. Wireless security. Okay, here on this tab, you'll notice there's not a whole lot to it, other than it's telling me that the security mode is currently disabled. Now again, we'll learn in the wireless security lesson all about things like WEP, WPA, and WPA2. Okay, and you'll notice that WPA and WPA2 have both a personal and an enterprise, and we'll learn all about the difference between them. There's also something here called radius, and I'm just not even going to go there for right now. That will also be addressed in the security lesson. What I will tell you is that regardless of which form of security you decide to pick, the setup is going to be similar. And to be more specific, WEP, WPA personal, or WPA2 personal, it's going to be similar. Enterprise is a lot more complicated, and I'm not going to demo it for you here. But if I pick WPA2 personal, you will see that I now have additional fields that I need to fill in. Okay, the first thing is that I get to choose between the different algorithms, which again, not going to go into that here. More specifically, this is the part I will talk about here, you need to enter in the WPA shared key. In other words, this is the passphrase that a user would need to enter when trying to connect to this network. Okay, you'll notice that again, it automatically populated with how I had it set up previously, which you'll notice was a super secure password that I tend to use when I'm in a training or testing environment. Something I learned from years of teaching Microsoft classes, and Microsoft liked to use this password, which is capital P, the @ symbol, lowercase SSW, the number 0, and lowercase RD. That way, you have a password that is considered to be secure because it's 8 characters long, you have lowercase, you have uppercase, you have a number, and you have a symbol. Whatever you want to put in there, no matter how secure or maybe not as secure, that's up to you. Okay, I've seen people put full phrases in for this shared key. That's fine if you want to do that. Just understand that this passphrase is how people connect to your wireless network. So how secure you make this password has to do with how secure you want your wireless network to be. There is one other setting on this page which we're going to skip right past. It's not anything I want you to worry about right now, which has to do with this group key renewal. The reason I'm going to skip through some of this is some of these things are specific sometimes to individual devices, and I want you to keep your focuses on the things that are going to be on all devices and all configurations. So just to go back and quickly review, we set up our wireless network. We gave it a name. We are broadcasting that name. We also declared whether we were going to be B and or G and what channel. Now here under security, we determine what type of security we want to use, what type of algorithm, and what we want the password to be. If I click to the next tab, this actually has to do with security as well. It says wireless MAC filter. If we want to enable MAC filtering, this really has to do with security. And we will learn about in the security lesson. But what it comes down to is you can explicitly prevent certain computers from accessing the wireless network by putting in their MAC address, the MAC address of their wireless network card. Or we could block everybody and allow just specific computers to be allowed to connect. And you would do that by saying, all right, permit only the PCs listed. You edit the MAC filter list, and you'll see here again, I've had this in place before. I had, this was a dummy system, and this was an actual system that I wanted to allow in. But you would just fill in the list of MAC addresses that you are willing to allow access to your network. Or if you selected it the other way, then those MAC addresses would not be allowed on the wireless network. So I'm going to go ahead and disable MAC filtering. I'm not worried about that for right now. The last thing we're going to do here is I'll go to the advanced wireless settings. And the reason I brought you here really is not so much to actually teach you any of this, but more to show you that even on some of the most basic wireless access points, you have a certain level of sophistication and control when it comes to managing and configuring your wireless network. Okay, so I don't really want you to worry about anything that you're seeing here. I just wanted to show you that I'm using the most basic of basic Linksys wireless routers, and I have some control over my wireless network. Now, there is one thing that I failed to do, and I'm curious if you caught it or not. And that is, if I go back to wireless security, you'll notice it's still disabled. You want to know why that is? The reason is because even though I told it I wanted to go to WPA2 personal, and even though I had it configured with an algorithm and a shared key, you know what I didn't do? I didn't click the button that says Save Settings. I just wanted to point that out because I will tell you that on many different wireless access points, you have to be conscious of doing that. That is one of the biggest mistakes that I've seen people walk into. I've had people call me over and say, how come this won't set up? I did everything right, and nothing's set up. They're like, I swear I did it. Well, you have to save the settings. Okay, so if I click Save Settings, it'll say that they are successful. Continue. It'll take just a moment for the screen to come back up. But while we're waiting, I will tell you that that's pretty much it. That's how you set up a wireless network. Here in my office, anybody who comes in with, let's say, a laptop or any computer, or these days it could even be your phone or whatever, any device that has Wi-Fi capabilities, they are now going to be able to connect to Ed's office as long as they know this super secret password. Now, one last thing that I want to talk to you about before we wrap up this lesson is understanding the characteristics of antennas. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, and I'm going to tell you that I'm going over this because it is listed as one of the objectives for Network Plus. What this really has to do with is it has a lot to do with more of your outdoor antennas. If you were going to be a true wireless networking administrator, and that's not really what Network Plus is set up for. Network Plus, you should understand the basics. But just in case, I want to go ahead and talk to you about the fact that when looking at different antennas, there are certain characteristics. And by the way, technically, even the antennas used with indoor access points and things like that, all this stuff still applies. You just tend to not pay quite as much attention to it, and again, unless you're setting up an enterprise environment. But here are some of the terms. You know, I literally could probably talk to you for 2 hours on just what all of this stuff means. But you need to understand that some of the ideas behind what antenna is being used has to do with the amount of gain that an antenna has to offer. So gain has to do with power. It's not, again, if you've been trained in this, I'm not being very literal, not being overly technical. But we have beam widths, both horizontal and vertical. In other words, how does the beam actually travel from the antenna? There's something called rear lobe coverage, and this has to do with a directional antenna, which I suppose that's one thing that you should keep in consideration. If it's directional, so if it's going to be sending the signal in a certain direction, how much coverage is there in the opposite direction that you may not actually want to have? We have polarization, cost, right? How much does it cost? How do you intend to use it? Now, when it comes to manufacture, that's listed because, well, that has to do with, you know, how reputable are they, right? Quality, and how good are they at warranty repairs, upgrades, things like that. We have electrical characteristics like impedance, which is resistance, VSWR, VSWR. I'm not even going to go into it, but that is a term. You know, so you want to take those types of electrical characteristics into consideration. How you actually can attach the antenna. In other words, what type of connectors is it using? And again, this has to do with more of your outdoor extended high-range antennas. And again, for your outdoor stuff, available mounting gear. So again, I will tell you, if you're really going to be a high-end wireless networking administrator and you go out there and really learn about all this, I mean, that's great. But for the purposes of what I want you to know right now, I threw this on there because you could get a question about one of these terms on Network Plus, and I just want to make sure that you can handle that question. So that brings us to the end of this lesson, where we've gone over really the basics of wireless networking. And speaking of this lesson just being about the basics, I strongly encourage you to watch the other lesson that we have in this course on securing wireless networking. Because really, when it comes down to truly setting up a wireless network, you need to not just set it up from a pure basic standpoint, you have to make sure to secure it. Because if you remember way back to the beginning, we talked about one of the issues with wireless networking that people look at is it as secure as a wired network? Okay, so in that lesson, we'll cover that. But that's all I have for you in this lesson, so I'll see you in the next one.